Hey, everybody, this is Paul. Real quick before we get into the podcast, I just want to let you know that I have launched a new newsletter called Local News Industry Pulse. And it is a briefing of news, policy, trends, and more in the local news industry straight to your inbox every Thursday morning. So if you're enjoying the content I'm putting out with the podcast, I think you would also get a lot of value from the newsletter. So if you have a minute, go subscribe really quick to Local News Industry Pulse. You can scroll down in your podcast app and click on the link at the very bottom of the show notes right now, or go to localnewsindustrypulse.beehive.com. That's localnewsindustrypulse.beehiv.com/subscribe, and you can sign up there and stay informed on everything that's going on in the local news industry every Thursday. All right, thanks. Let's get into today's episode.
I think that there's a bright future there, but I also want to be clear that I don't think that future looks much like the past. And I think that's okay. I think the form of serving local audiences so that they are better informed is more important than having, a certain set number of people we call reporters doing a certain thing in a certain area. My goal is to try to make sure that communities are as informed as they can be and facilitate that through the work that we're doing right now at Lion. But more broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of building that has to happen between here and there. And that's the thing I'm excited about doing.
This is Small Press Big Ideas, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Gewertz. Small Press Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Chris Krewson. Chris is the executive director of Lion Publishers. For anybody out there who doesn't know, Lion stands for Local Independent Online News Publishers. They're the nation's only membership organization for local independent online news publishers. So, Chris, thanks for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here.
Happy to help.
Yeah. So I just did a little, kind of corporate-y intro from LinkedIn there, but I was wondering if you could maybe just give us a brief bio of yourself, as far back as you want to go on your life and your career, and kind of how you came to become the executive producer or executive director there at Lion.
Sure. So I've been at Lion for a little more than 5 years. I joined in 2019 and had almost a year in the job before the world shut down. Prior to that, I was an executive for a local media company that operated a few sites, one of which a couple of years before that I had launched. I was the first editor of a site called Billy Penn in Philadelphia, bankrolled by a guy named Jim Brady, who's now the vice president for journalism at the Knight Foundation. But at the time, he was just a guy who was coming off a stint at a major newspaper company and itching to do a startup newsroom. So we did that together. We launched a second site in Pittsburgh. And I became that vice president when we merged with a company called Denverite and thought we were building an empire. And instead, we had 3 sites that none of which were making enough to be sustainable in their markets. We raised 3 rounds of funding, couldn't raise a 4th, and I needed a job, and Lion had one open. So that's the one I took. Before that, I spent 4 years in a variety of roles at Hollywood, in the Hollywood Reporter, and before that, Variety. But prior to that, most of my career was spent in local news. I live outside Philadelphia, which is where I bought my house when I worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was executive online editor there when it filed for bankruptcy, which necessitated the trip west. Before that, I spent almost 7 years at the Allentown Morning Call doing a variety of roles, all of which were digital, from the website to a CD-ROM project to radio broadcasts and video, back when newspapers thought we were going to do all those things. And before that, I started out life as a reporter at the small town newspaper where I went to school, State College, Pennsylvania, the home of Penn State.
So yeah, it goes way back. It's funny. You and I spoke the other day, but I didn't know you were involved with Denverite. I spent most of my life in the Denver area, and I definitely remember that I was a fan. So that's cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, we took it off the hands of the founding team, one of whom was one of the executives involved in the sale of DoubleClick. Another is the current CEO of the Lenfest Institute in Philadelphia. And like I said, we thought we were building an empire when they asked us if we would take it over for them. And it introduced challenges of growth and platforms at a time when we had just launched our second site in Pittsburgh. And I'm very grateful for the experience. I got to go out there and meet Dave Burdick, the great editor of Denverite, who has a brand new role at the American Journalism Project leading newsroom strategy for that group. And Dave's a friend and a great editor and a great strategist. So it's interesting how small the circle of folks are in this space of building things. But I'm glad Dave is still involved in it. When the site sold, Denverite wound up at Colorado Public Radio, and Dave ascended to an assistant managing editor job or something with CPR, and just left there a little while ago to pursue this new role.
Yeah, it's funny the connections you see when you start getting out there and talking to people. That's cool. So back to Lion. So you've basically spent your entire career in starting in local news and kind of like you just described, working your way up. Can you? And this may tie in. The point of the show is combating the narrative that local news is dead and like the challenges it's faced over the last 20 years. So speaking of that, could you talk about the origins of Lion? I've read about them briefly on the site, but if you could tell me, I don't know, the players, what they were thinking at the time when they started it and kind of the mission behind it.
The roots of Lion originate in the project of a fellow at the Reynolds Journalism Institute, a woman named Michelle McClellan, who noticed the launch of a bunch of independent digital websites in the 2010s and launched a site called Michelle's List as part of her project. Decided it would be a great idea to gather a bunch of those in one place. And in Chicago in 2010 and 2011, she hosted conferences called Block by Block. And at those conferences, a different sort of organization, the Patterson Foundation, funded a one-day workshop on, and this is going to sound incredibly nostalgic, but on sustainability and on the sustainability of local businesses. Paired those publishers with coaches who had worked in larger media organizations for something called Super Camp, where they tried to essentially help these publishers build stronger businesses. Lion itself formed as an independent nonprofit a year later, was originally incorporated in Arizona because our initial board chair, a guy named Dylan Smith, who runs the Tucson Sentinel, has always lived there as a former, newspaper digital person for a Tucson newspaper before he launched his indie site. And like many nonprofits, spent several years fighting to gain enough resources to hire somebody part-time and then turn that person into a full-timer and start to build a reputation for the organization. And had several sort of full-time and then an interim executive director, guys like Matt DiRenzo and Steve Beatty, who got the organization to the point where it had earned $1 million grant from the Knight Foundation, whereupon they launched their search for an executive director right around the time that the project I was embarking on had run out of money. So that's what led me to Lion, was that it was the chance to do what I had sort of just done. And helping Jim build local sites, I had the chance to build a support framework for other local sites who've very clearly been struggling with this question of sustainability for, almost a decade at that point. And yeah, the players have changed a little bit. We've added many, many more to the fold. But I would say the profile of the average independent news publisher really hasn't changed all that much, in that the folks who tend to be driven to launch these kinds of businesses largely emerge from newsrooms and very rapidly need to ground themselves in the skills that a business leader needs around strategy, budgeting, financial planning, that have not been hallmarks of the journalistic world to date, right? So we are rapidly sort of trying to train journalists to be publishers and business people.
Yeah, and you and I kind of spoke about that the other day. It's like, I don't know if I mentioned to you or somebody else. It's funny because I don't come from a journalism background, and it's kind of getting more and more into the ecosystem and working with more publishers. I'm like, it's always surprising me that there's such a division between the journalism side and the business side. And it's just interesting to me. I haven't worked in many other industries or anything where it's like that. So, what are there guidelines that publishers have to follow to be accepted into Lion? But do they have to adhere by like journalistic standards? What are the rules to actually be in the organization, a member?
Sure. So Lion is a membership association. We're a 501c3, but we are a nonprofit with about 600 members across the US and Canada. Most of them are in the US, about 35, 36 are in Canada. To become a member of Lion, there's an application that's online. We have a join button at the top of our website. And if you click on that, you'll see a list of membership criteria or how we screen people who want to be in the association. We require, just as every letter says, right, local, you have to cover a community, independent, you can't be operated by a church or a political party or a hedge fund or be publicly traded. Online sort of speaks for itself. We do not discriminate against print. We have some publishers who have print in their arsenal of projects, but we do require that publishers be committed to building a digital business. News, right? We have had some very interesting attempts to circumvent that one in our membership over the years, but have to be engaged in, something recognizable as a news product, and they have to be publishers, right? They not sort of freelancers, et cetera, et cetera. So those are broadly speaking the criteria, but there's much more detail and you can get as in the weeds as you want to on our website.
Okay. Yeah, I assumed there was some kind of criteria because otherwise, people just be signing up for, what do they call them? The pink slime websites with a political agenda or something like that. And so
from my very first days at Lion, we were sort of starting to put barriers in place to keep those types of organizations or those operated by PACs, right, out of the membership.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. So I know, Lion helps publishers build sustainable businesses. So when you talked about the profile of the average Lion member right now, what are you seeing? What models or strategies are winning right now, like as of 2024?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We sort of have a couple of different tracks inside the Lion audience. If I'm going to segment them, some of our members are the largest in their state. Most of those are nonprofit newsrooms. The Texas Tribune, Cal Matters, Vermont Digger are all of those are, by the way, American Journalism Project newsrooms, which are newsrooms that are sort of organized with the help of, deep philanthropic support in all those cities. They tend to have larger staffs. They tend to, Cal Matters is just coming off of a merger with The Markup, which was an independent newsroom focused on sort of platform accountability and sort of tech accountability. So for it to merge with a California state publisher, home of much of that innovation, is kind of an interesting move, but also speaks to, I think, some overall instability in the field. The Texas Tribune a year or two ago had the first layoffs that it had ever had. So the large places are certainly not immune to sort of sectoral issues around revenue. A lot of Lion members are smaller, cover communities. Some are a husband and wife team where the husband does the news and the wife sells the ads, or vice versa. Some are a person who maybe took their newspaper buyout money and launched a URL and then tried to quickly build a business around it. Some cover a segment of the economy, people that cover the healthcare industry in their state or their region, or people who cover only local business news. We welcome all those approaches at Lion. We don't think there's one true way to do this, but a lot of the way that we talk to our publisher members about sustainability really tries to broaden the conversation around more than just, because the easy shortcut people try to get to quickly is what's the magic bullet? What's the one thing that if people did this everywhere, we would solve the crisis? And unfortunately, there really isn't one thing. There are people trying the very small, cover a part of the community in my part-time and eventually convert that to a full-time job. There are folks like Ken Doctor, who has launched a successful Pulitzer Prize winning site out in California. Look out, local Santa Cruz, who's about to launch a second site up in Eugene, Oregon, who's really trying to be a replacement sort of metro newspaper. And his model is to look for a place where, privately held venture capital firm or publicly traded company that starved its newspaper is vulnerable, and then launch with a relatively large staff and a relatively large business team and try to take that business from them. It really varies across the board. I think the attributes that the most sustainable to speak of members share is that they are diversified in their revenue and that they are unafraid of experimentation and change, because this business, as I've just experienced it over the span of just the sort of startup part of my career, has already shifted 2 or 3 times. Everyone is sort of, laughs at the trope of the pivot to video, but that was a real thing that our industry has struggled with. And part of, I think, the trap of the thinking that we'll just find one approach is the hard reality is people have to get used to change, not just to move to a new thing, but to get used to changing, because we're in a world that's already been reshaped several times by technologies that we hadn't heard of a year or two before. And now the methods of discovery are shifting so fast in a world where platforms are dialing back the news in the case of the social platforms, and in Google's case, dialing up the AI results in ways that are going to have profound effects on discoverability and availability of the way we do this stuff right now. So kind of went a little off the rails there on that answer, but I do think it's a really complex question, and I don't have a great one thing to point you towards.
Yeah, I think the way you framed the kind of the attributes of what do you say, diversifying and experimenting, and not being afraid to change. That's awesome. That's I totally agree, and that's what I've seen too. Falling down this rabbit hole, as I say, and into the local media sustainability space. So, okay, that was a hard question. This next one, I don't know if is much easier, but that I had it written down was, what direction do you see local publishers heading in the coming years? And when I say that, it could be, like you said, there was a pivot to video. I've noticed in my own circles, people I've talked to, newsletters are popping off. That's just everywhere in business right now. So, if you had like a magic ball to see in the future, what would you guess will be the way things are going to go in the coming years?
Yeah, so I'll answer that first with kind of what we're seeing from our member data. So every year, Lion surveys our members. When you renew at Lion, you have to fill out a form. And one of the things we saw this year in terms of the products our newsrooms are offering in various markets across the country is, for the first time, newsletters as a product outpaced articles. So more publishers are newsletter sort of writers first, and text writers second. And this year was the year they reported back kind of the most products they ever had. So people are really sort of diving into the spirit of experimentation, which is great to see. The thing that I think is the most interesting, but I can't really speak to how ultimately effective it's going to be, is thinking about taking the idea of AI out of the space where it's scary and disruptive and, an internet full of things written by robots for robots, right?
Right.
And more into a place where we see it as an opportunity. So there's a guy named Trey Brandrett who used to run products at Vox Media, who did a provocation at an event I was at the early part of this year in Charleston, South Carolina, when he talked about AI from the perspective of, the reason ChatGPT in particular took off as a tool, and what the surveys had told the engineers were that people felt incredibly empowered by it. They felt like this added superpowers to their ability to do tasks in the real world. And, we can laugh or be horrified by the results of some of the experimentations that we've seen around AI. But if you think about the world, the ecosystem that we're building, the projects that publishers are building today, they tend to look a lot like the ecosystem they're intended to replace, right? You see sort of news sites segmented into areas that used to be the sections of the newspaper. And I still see to this day brand new sites with a word on it that says Metro. And a lot of people who are normies don't know what that means, right? My kids are, my daughter is a 21-year-old teaching in, or 22-year-old now, I guess, teaching in Louisiana elementary school. My son is a sophomore at Temple University. Neither one of them looks at these sites regularly. They get their information from TikTok, if they get it at all. So we're not producing things as an industry that the next generation is interested in accessing to answer their questions. But if you think of local newsrooms as something else, and you think about AI as a layer that connects those sort of repositories of local information to the wider world, I think all kinds of possibilities open up that are way beyond the sort of commercialized internet. And it makes sense, right? If the fretting about how people are finding things on the internet is because we are losing the form of what time is the Super Bowl, when an article is a lousy way to answer that question. And you think about all the questions people might have about their community that local newsrooms could hold the answer to. Why did my taxes go up? Hey, who's on my school board anyway? What happened with that person who was missing the other week? Hey, why did this building shut down? And what's going to go in where the old brewery used to be? These are all things that newsrooms have, usually in structured data, we call those articles, that an AI source could very helpfully answer for people who had those questions. And oh, by the way, introduce an entirely new layer of experience to living and breathing and growing up in a place. I think that is incredibly exciting. I do not see a direct path to get there. And I also do not see a direct path to monetization. But that's also how every iteration of the internet has worked so far. It has been the audience adopting something first, such as the internet pivoting to phones, and people like Mark Zuckerberg orienting Facebook and getting rid of its sort of very lucrative desktop advertising business and shifting everything into phones. He tried a similar pivot with the metaverse. Not sure that one stuck as well,
Not so
but
far.
he got his company used to the idea that it had to change, right? And now they're starting to move into AI in their way. And I suspect it's going to be a land grab at this point, right? Which is why Google's willing to risk its incredibly lucrative search advertising business and put a lot of things into AI because it's kind of worried somebody else is going to get there first. Ultimately, this keeps kind of pushing publishers kind of farther from the center of where the users are. So I'm a little sort of worried about that distance. But with that said, I don't think we're any more sort of at the mercy of technology than we really have been for probably the last 40 years, as the sort of regional bundles of monopoly that were local print newspapers have slowly seen their unbundling happen, and their audiences kind of fragment to those places. So I think that there's a bright future there, but I also want to be clear that I don't think that future looks much like the past. And I think that's okay. I think the form of serving local audiences so that they are better informed is more important than having, a certain set number of people we call reporters doing a certain thing in a certain area. My goal is to try to make sure that communities are as informed as they can be and facilitate that through the work that we're doing right now at Lion. But more broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of building that has to happen between here and there. And that's the thing I'm excited about doing.
Today's episode is sponsored by localpod.co. LocalPod offers podcast production and consulting for local news organizations and only local news organizations. LocalPod creates weekly news podcasts based off of the top stories from your publication. You provide the script, we handle the rest. We narrate your news, edit it, produce it with a custom intro and outro with music, and distribute the podcast to all available podcast apps. Your listeners will see your branding and hear your content in their podcast feed, just like wherever you're listening to right now. Podcasts are one of the most engaging digital formats, which is why we can also help you monetize your podcast as well. We offer custom ad reads for your podcast, and we can also set up subscriptions so that you can monetize your audience directly. Have you thought of launching a podcast but want to control it in-house? We can help you with that too. LocalPod offers podcast coaching. We offer in-depth one-on-one coaching calls, along with the actionable steps you need to launch a successful revenue-generating podcast of your own. To find out more, visit localpod.co, that's localpod.co, or just click on the link in the episode show notes in your podcast app. All right, back to the show. Man, yeah, I could not agree with you more. Just to touch on the AI piece for a minute. Since the dust has kind of settled a bit, since, ChatGPT was first, unveiled on the world, I am becoming more and more convinced that artificial intelligence is just bad branding. If they had just called it some kind of new software from the get-go, I don't think people would have such a bad connotation with it, of the Terminator or whatever, getting rid of everybody's jobs and may go down. Just one quick tangent real quick that you reminded me of, how it's like a time saver and how it can be utilized in local media space. So my wife and I bought this old house that I'm in right now in March of 2020. Literally April 8th, we closed of 2020. Crazy time. With the goal of renovating the upstairs apartment into an Airbnb, which we did. And I do not have a background in construction. I literally went to YouTube University while ripping down walls and putting plumbing in and all this stuff. And mind you, this is 3 or 4 years ago. I'd be searching through Google and, YouTube, trying to find exactly what it is I'm trying to do. Now, flash forward 3 years, we're doing some more work on our house now. We've been talking about it in the last month or so. Now I'm like, let me just ask ChatGPT how to do that. And it literally spits out exactly step by step. It's like a tool that was not available to me a few years ago. That's like such a time saver. And that's kind of my view on it in its current state. But I really like your overall take on where it's headed and how it can be utilized. And it's a mixed bag for sure, but tend to be more of an optimist, I guess, myself. I'll shift gears here a little bit. A big thing that you guys do at Lion is your sustainability audits. So I was just curious to dig into that a bit, how those work, and what that looks like for a local publisher when they sign up for you, what that entails.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So we started the sustainability audits as a way to kind of get a measurement of the publishers we were intending to help with some small cohort-based programs we were running kind of immediately after COVID hit. Um, we were running a 6-month, what was called the Startups Lab with Google. And then we had a 2-year program that we were running with Facebook at the time called the Revenue Growth Fellowship Program. And in both of those cases, we felt a really strong need to get some qualitative and quantitative data that showed us who we were helping and where they needed help. And so we determined that this sort of analytic that was used by a company called Sembra Media, which is a nonprofit that serves primarily Spanish-speaking audiences in Central and South America, looked like a pretty cool tool. And so we frankly swiped the idea and then tried to productize it and turn it into a sort of a one-stop sheet for a publisher to understand where their business stood in a whole bunch of areas. And these could be, audience visitors, but also incorporation documents and paperwork, and also, size and makeup of staff if they had one, types of products they offered, types of things they covered, et cetera. That was sort of version 1 of the audit. And we did, in our first 2 years, probably, about 50 of those through all the cohorts that we did. And as we started to sort of build up our muscles around it, we had the opportunity in 2021 with a project through the Google News Initiative where we could pair that audit tool with a little bit of funding, about $9,000. The idea would be, of the previous work that we had done, the fellowship and the Startups Lab, each of those carried a little bit more money, but were much more intensive programs where we were working with publishers over time, and we were applying expert coaches and lesson plans and meetups of their cohorts, et cetera, et cetera. It was a very involved thing. And we sort of thought, what if we took the 2 most popular parts of that, which were the diagnostic tool and the money, and just did that, right? Strip out the time commitment, because we know these publishers are just barraged with requests, and all of them are working insane hours to cover their communities. What if we just gave them sort of here's where you are, and here's some cash to get some of that stuff done? And it was unsurprisingly enormously popular. And so when Google came back to us so 2 things happened. One is we renewed our grant with the Knight Foundation, the $1 million that brought me here. We were up for renewal a couple of years ago. And we're in year 2 of the 3-year grant now, and it tripled from $1 million to $2.85 million to underwrite our operations. And as part of that, Knight agreed to pick up the cost for a couple of hundred more sustainability audits. And right about that time, Google came to us and said, hey, how about if we make this program a heck of a lot bigger, and sort of asked us to do 380 of them with stipends of $20,000 each over 2 years. So we went from 50 to 100 to about 150 each of the next 2 years, right? Really, I mean, that's what hockey stick growth looks like. And so, we were sort of excited to say yes on behalf of our publishers. At the time, we had no idea how we would do it. We have an amazing crew that's worked on this. My former deputy director, Annika Anand, our former associate director of learning and evaluation, Lisa Hayamoto, her incredible team, Elaine Diaz and Andrew Rockway, were the people who sort of did the outreach, led the calls to find coaches. We have worked with a ton of industry coaches over the years, paired those publishers with experts, with an interview process that's led to a document. And so we're now, we've gone through 4 iterations of these audits, updating them every year and make them a little bit easier to do, a little bit more comprehensive, have an enormous sort of bunch of suggestions that past coaches have dropped in terms of like remedying some of the common things they see publishers struggling with. We got about as good as we could get on how to do that in the way that we've been doing it. And it has proven to be the most popular program that we run. I'm under no illusions. I think a lot of that's the money. $20,000 in unrestricted funding is an incredibly powerful motivator for publishers. But the ones that I take the most joy in seeing are from the publishers who tell us, yeah, the money was nice, but really the audit has been transformational. And the organization that won the Transformational Impact Award at this year's Lion Awards a couple of weeks ago in Chicago was the Johnson County Post, which basically told us our audit was the kick that we needed to narrow our offerings, rebrand our publication, go all in on the strategies that we had sort of thought we might needed to do, but it was the push we needed to get us to a much more sustainable place. Thank you so much for doing that. And that's exactly the impact that we've seen time and again when you are able to apply sort of broad learnings across. Now, we've done probably more than 500 audits over the last 4 years, and can really start to zoom out and think about the field and not just on a per member basis. And that's sort of the power of this project as it's rolled along. So naturally, what we want to do next year is blow it all up and start over again.
That's great. Could you? So you talked a bit about was it the Johnson County Post, the sustainability of the year, and how it helped them. So what for anybody listening out there who this may be helpful to, what would you say the biggest red flag or some of the biggest red flags that come up during a sustainability audit for a local publisher would be? Is there something that you see that is like recurring or like a theme, anything like that?
We try not to judge. So I would never say red flag, but I would say a startling amount of publishers turn a URL on, and there's a big difference between that and running a business. And what I mean by that is there are big gaps for people who don't know which or what paperwork to file to sort of be official in their state or region. How many of them have know how to build a budget, let alone a sort of year over year projection plan for growth. A lot of the most popular courses and labs and cohort-based offerings that we have run are around removing blockers for revenue growth, because organizations, tend to try to jump in and fill all the gaps left by a local newspaper with a tenth of the resources or less. And it's really hard to apply a few resources when you don't yet know how to measure what's working and what's not. And this is not rocket science. This is product thinking. This is build, test, measure, iterate thinking, right? But that school of thought is not how a newsroom typically operates. And if that's the background of most of our founders, then they're coming into this without that in their tool set. So we're sort of helping them do that stuff as well. This is behind a lot of our work in Line, and it's also behind the work of a sort of sister organization on which I serve on the board of directors, the Tiny News Collective, which tries to do sort of similar work at an earlier stage in a publisher's process, from sort of before they launch to getting their MVP out the door and then helping them in those early stages. A lot of the challenges are the same, even though the scale of them might be different.
Okay, that's great. Would you say you said that one thing that comes up is they'll these kind of newer local online publishers will try to fill the gaps of every part of a newspaper. Would you kind of recommend or coach them to just focus, like just work on your newsletter or whatever it may be, your one product, and build from there? Or
a lot of times it's just do a survey of like, tell me all the things that you're doing. Tell me all the things you think are working. If it's not working and you're still doing it, why? It's a very simple exercise. And yet people get very caught up in the day to day and just think of everything they have to do that day. And a lot of the things we encourage them to do is just take a beat, take that moment of reflection. And, so far, another sort of very popular element to this is not just the report, but the time with a coach who will sit and listen. And the act of listening to these publishers who are, let's face it, doing a very hard thing in isolation all over the country, that feels therapeutic in the sense that, there are not infrequently tears on these calls because they are finally getting to talk to somebody about the challenges they face. And these people are not judging them on what they're doing, but are offering at the initial call just an ear and just asking, very simple questions about why. And so it's been a very powerful dynamic and a very powerful intervention every time we've done it. And, the editorial background, the editorial calendar doesn't lend itself to a lot of introspection, right? You're kind of just on to the next, whether it's the next big story or the next big news cycle, especially in an election year. And so, we also had to sort of train ourselves because the needs they have go far beyond business. They want help writing stories. They want help finding freelancers. And we're just focused on sort of the business question and the question of sustainability and pointing them towards resources for the rest. But it's also humbling to know that, as big as Lion has gotten. And when I started, I was the only full-time employee. And now we have a staff of 12. We're about to hire our 13th person. I've got plans for a 14th in the works. As much as that's been growth, it's still all laser focused on the idea of helping them build better businesses. And there's so much more help that they need. It's humbling.
Yeah, that's, man, well, you're doing great work. And kind of going back to what you were saying about just getting caught up in the day to day, it sounds so simple. Like test, look at it, iterate. I mean, I run my own small business, and I get caught up in my daily tasks I have to do. And when I do have that time on a Saturday, if I sit down and kind of look at the broad, zoom out to 30,000 feet, I'm like, is this really serving me? Is it? What is this doing? So I totally get that. It sounds so simple, but it's when you're in the weeds, it's can be challenging. So you spoke pretty in depth about the sustainability audits and like the background behind those, and then you and I spoke the other day, and I kind of looked on your site. Could you speak about the is the sustainability 360 program? Is that kind of what you were speaking about, and the revamping of the audits, or is that a new kind of thing you guys are working on?
So there's a couple things that we're going to do. I'm glad you asked. Thank you. There's a couple things that we're going to do as an organization in 2025 and beyond. One of them follows the goal in our strategic growth plan, which we published last year. And that's that anybody who's a Lion member and wants a sustainability audit should be able to get one. And under our current format, if all 600 members of Lion decided in January and then again in December if they wanted an audit, it would break us. To do that, we have to decouple it from the funding, but that program with Google is ending anyway. So that's kind of neither here nor there. We don't see ourselves long-term, by the way, as a funder, although I will say if any foundation or technology company or incredibly wealthy donor would like to give us money to hand out to our members, my DMs are open. But, if we're going to decouple it from funding anyway, how might we sort of break apart and rebuild this combination of what we're calling an audit to serve that wider membership whenever they need it? And so where we landed on is the two most popular elements of this, the two biggest moving pieces, and the things that cause us the most resource to manage are the technology of the survey, the sort of qualitative data of metrics that a publisher self-reports, and the coaching, the quantitative context setting, and here's what to do now, soon, and later to strengthen your business. So each one of those things becomes a self-service marketplace. The audit becomes a survey tool that you get back instantaneously as soon as you fill it out, that's weighted by and informed by the 500 we've done before, puts it in context, and gives you recommendations to what we're calling our expert network, which is a group of Lion vetted coaches and consultants that can help you with anything that your audit says is a point of interest. And what I'm doing right now is sort of working with funders who are interested in sort of packages of audits plus dedicated coaching hours for folks in the expert network to serve cohorts of members that they're interested in sort of funding. So we're not really so much going for grants as we are seeing ourselves as almost a consultancy, a boutique kind of consultancy, and giving publisher and funder access for the first time at the same time to the audit. So they have a way to measure their investment over time in these newsrooms. This is version 5 of the audit. It leans heavily on our organization's kind of transition into more of a Salesforce world where we're keeping all of our data about all of our members, and then being able to sort of visualize and provide on-demand dashboards that show us things about every organization we've ever audited, but also similar size organizations in similar parts of the country executing on similar missions.
That's so cool. I love having it just kind of the self-serve model. That's just with my business, I love that kind of stuff. Punching in and seeing like, how am I doing? What's it going to tell me? Where can I work on this stuff? So that's
right.
That's really
so
cool.
For us to be able to do that at scale, there was no way to get, because like I said, it almost broke us to do 140 audits after we did 100, right? 100 felt like a stretch. And then we exceeded it in the next year. And so we kind of realized very quickly that we couldn't keep doing it that way at the scale that we foresaw, not just our existing membership, but our future membership could possibly want. So we decided we had to build for that future and to break apart the bundle that we had created sort of into its component parts and then build those up. So that's the impetus behind and the thinking behind that. And we're sort of hard at work beavering away at version 5 of the audit as we speak. The other program that we're piloting right now is something that we're really kind of excited about that we're calling Sustainability 360. And this comes directly from our work on the cohort-based labs that we had done, that Google was funding, and the Revenue Growth Fellowship that Facebook funded. And out of both of those experiences, where we helped, a dozen newsrooms with the fellowship program and probably close to 50 or 60 newsrooms with all the labs that we have done, the startups and sustainability labs, we found ourselves gravitating towards publishers that we saw needing the most help, and the most common problems and pain points they had technically fell out of bounds of the programs we were running. So we'd have a member in the Revenue Growth Fellowship program all of a sudden have an HR issue. And technically, if it's outside the bounds of the program, we can't help them. And that didn't feel good.
Right.
In the bounds of the program, right? Like we could make recommendations, but we weren't set up at that time to do what we are doing in Sustainability 360, which is trying to take a holistic approach to their businesses, work with them fairly intensely over a period of 2 years, and take ones that are in one stage of sustainability and be responsible for moving them to the next. So the metric that we put in our strategic growth plan was that we would eventually like to move 100 businesses from the building to the maintaining stage in our maturity model, which, sort of we've written about and talked about, because our sort of theory of the case is that all these digital native publishers kind of go through these life cycle stages. And we want to move all of them to sustainability, but we're going to hold ourselves as an organization accountable to our big, hairy, audacious goal is time bound, and it's, bound to just a couple of these stages so that we know whether we're succeeding as an organization. And so we just launched the pilot for this 2 weeks ago. And right now we have a call out for coaches to help in this inaugural pilot, which will help 6 newsrooms that we're in the process of recruiting now. And this 9-month pilot will tell us a lot about whether we're on track or whether we're full of hot air. I suspect that given everything we've done so far, we're going to wind up with a lot of interest. But one thing this does not include is dollars, right? We are not giving publishers dollars directly as part of Sustainability 360 on purpose to test our theory that. But instead, right, when we work with the newsroom and we might say, you know what, all these newsrooms could use back office support centralized. And so Lion will foot the bill for that for the next 2 years. The theory being at the end of that process, they are strong enough as businesses to begin paying their own way for a group accounting project or something like that, right? And I don't yet know what the answer will be. All we have are very educated guesses around all the work we've done so far. The point of all of that, I think, is to help spin up lessons, asynchronous courses, learnings, playbooks that we can use and share with any Lion member who joins. Because so far our experience has been, we learn a whole bunch helping these cohort-based groups that we can spread to the entire membership. So that is Sustainability 360, and we're really excited about it.
That's so cool. Yeah. Man, it's impressive. You coming on as the only full-time member, growing to 12, 13, 14, whatever it was. And now to Sustainability 360. That's such a cool program. The logistics of it kind of hurt my head, but I'm sure you guys know what you're doing and you know how to get there and everything.
We are cautiously optimistic with some history, I think.
There we go. Awesome. All right. Well, I've gotten through all my questions. Is there anything you want to promote or where listeners can find out more about Lion? Anything you want to point to or for me to link to for this episode?
I mean, our website is lionpublishers.com. Keep an eye out for that in our newsletter, where we share, a lot of our internal programs, but also a pretty great rundown of other resources for independent publishers. And, keep your eyes peeled for next year's Independent News Sustainability Summit. We're a couple of weeks away from announcing where we're going to head next. But, we sold this year's out with 530 plus people attending. And we're looking forward to doing the same thing next year.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you for coming on and keep up the good work, and I hope you have a good day.
Thanks, Paul. Good to meet you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.